Hello there, and welcome this week to Talking Flutes with me, Paul Wright. A big shout out, as always, to our wonderful sponsors, TJ Flutes, who have been with us since we began this journey 7 years ago. You can show them some flute love by visiting them on their socials at TJ Flutes and on the web at tjflutes.com. Today, we're exploring a topic that has, well, it always causes a surprising amount of debate in the flute-playing community. And the question is really quite simply, what do we call ourselves? Are we flutists or are we flautists? Are we flute players? I mean, what does each term mean and why do we care so much? Now, I know this has been written and asked around the flute world on socials and interweb for many, many, many years. But a few weeks ago, I've been in the process of rebuilding the website, the happyflutist.com. And the Happy Flutist, I've put it out on socials about what do you want to see, how many more new pieces do you want up. And what was really interesting is the people that came back on social said we won't listen to it because it's called Happy Flutist and not Happy Flautist. And others would say, why have you called it Happy Flutist and not Happy Flautist? And, do you know, it doesn't really bother me. I mean, in the UK, we have this thing where you have a scone or a scone, depending on what you say. It's like this piece of soda bready thing. It's a cake thing. And you have it in afternoon tea. And you slice it in half, and you have it with clotted cream and jam. Now, this is a very nonsensical thing, but it just excises so many people. Do you put the cream on first or the jam on first? And to some it really matters. I mean, personally, I put the jam on first and then I overload it with cream. But to many, many others, they put the cream on first and then the jam. And there is no middle ground. And I'm finding that constantly with flutists and flautists. And I didn't really want to do a podcast on this because really, I don't give a monkeys what you call yourself. You can call yourself a green tree or an armchair, but it doesn't really bother me. But I think just some of the feedback I got on socials about we won't listen to it because it says flutist, and also why have you called it flutist and not the Happy Flautist? I just thought, okay, enough of that. So I'm in London. As you can probably hear, there's a bit of noise in the background. It's a late August morning and it's a little gentle breeze, but at the moment there's not too much traffic. So I just thought I would sit down on a park bench and just look at the great naming debate, which is flutists or flautists. And over the next, I don't know how long it will take me, but 20 to 25 minutes, hopefully delve into the history behind these terms, examining the cultural and regional differences that have led to this divide, and also ask whether this debate is really worth having. I know to some it is, but for me it's not. So, whether you identify as a flutist, a flautist, a fluterer, a flute player, or a chimney sweep, or maybe you're just curious about the whole controversy, stick around because this episode may be just what you're looking for, or not. So if we can start by tracing the origins of these terms, the flute, as we will all know, as an instrument, has a storied history that spans many thousands of years, with versions of it appearing in nearly every ancient culture, from the bone flute of the Paleolithic area to the ornate silver, gold, platinum wood flutes of today. The instrument has seen countless iterations and variations, but what about the people who play the flute? The term flute is itself derived from the Latin word flatus or flatus, meaning blowing or breath, which gives us a clue as to how integral the act of blowing air through the instrument is to its identity. The first known use of the word flute in English dates back to the Middle Ages, when it referred to a broad category of woodwind instruments. However, the specific term flutist and flautist are much newer. The term flutist as a plane going over, but the term flutist seems to have appeared in English literature somewhere in the early 19th century, so sort of 1810, 1815, 18, that sort of time span. And the suffix ist, ist, is a common one in English, used to describe someone who practices a particular art or activity. I mean, think pianist, violinist, or harpist. Given this, flutist was a logical extension directly connecting the word flute with the person who plays it. So let's park that to one side, shall we? The arrival of flautist. Flautist entered the English language around about the same time, borrowing from the Italian flautista. The Italian influence on classical music was profound during this period, with many English-speaking musicians looking to Italy for inspiration and instruction. The adoption of Italian terms was common, and flautist became one of those borrowed terms. Oh, I'm getting a bit of cramp here. Hang on, let's stand up. But why did English speakers feel the need to borrow an Italian term when flutist already existed? Some things I've read suggest that the Italian term added a sense of sophistication and prestige, reflective of the European classical tradition that was revered by many musicians. Others believed it was simply a matter of preference and style, with flautist sounding more elegant or refined to certain ears. To better understand how these terms were used historically, it's helpful to look at some prominent flutists, or should I say flautists, or just flute players. Let's, for the term of this, so I don't upset anybody, call them flute players. So let's look at some from the 19th century. For instance, the great Theobald Böhm, a German flute player and composer who greatly influenced the design of the modern flute. He was often referred to as a flutist in English-speaking countries. Meanwhile, in Italy and parts of Europe, Böhm might have been called a flautista. During the same period in Britain, the term flautist began appearing more frequently in musical publications and concert programmes, and this suggests that while flutist may have been the default term in English, flautist was gaining traction, particularly in regions with strong ties to European classical traditions. Now that we've looked at brief historical origins, let's move on to how these terms are used around the world today, because the choice between flutist and flautist is often influenced by where you live, but there is more to it than just geography. In the United States and Canada, for example, flutist is the overwhelmingly preferred term. And this preference can be traced back to the American emphasis on linguistic efficiency and clarity. Americans tend to favour straightforward English-derived terms, which likely explains why flutist became the norm there. But it's not just about linguistic simplicity. The term flutist has also been standardised by major musical institutions in North America. For example, the National Flute Association, NFA in the United States, uses flutist in all of its official publications and communications. This widespread adoption by educational and professional organisations has cemented flutist as the preferred term for many American players. Let's cross over the pond for a moment. The British affinity for flautist. The situation here is quite different. In the United Kingdom, flautist is the term of choice. The British, known for their love of tradition, have a long history of adopting European, especially Italian and French, musical terms. Flautist fits neatly into this pattern, aligning really well with other musical terms like pianist, from the Italian pianista. But it's not just about tradition. Some flute players I've spoken to argue that flautist carries a certain level of sophistication that flutist lacks. It's seen as a more artistic and, you may say, refined term, which appeals to those who view their craft as part of a long-standing European musical tradition. Now, I have lots of chums in Australia, New Zealand, and are certainly beyond our European shores, and flautist is also the more commonly used term there, following, I suppose, the British tradition. However, as with many things in these countries, there's a blend of influences at play going on here. Some musicians and educators in Australia, for example, might use flutist due to American influences, particularly in contemporary music and pop culture. Interestingly, in South Africa, where British English has historically had a strong influence, flautist is more commonly used, though flutist is certainly not unheard of. This creates an intriguing mix of terminology that reflects the complex cultural and linguistic influences in each country. So let's just for a moment explore how these terms are perceived in non-English speaking countries. In France, for example, the term flutist is used, which clearly aligns more closely with flutist than flautist. This French term has its roots in the word flute, which, like it... I just realised what I said, flute. F-L-U with a grave accent over the top, T-E. Excuse my pronunciation, which, like its English counterpart, derives from the Latin flatus. In Germany, the term flutist is used again, aligning with flutist. However, in Italy, the birthplace of flautist, the term flautista is standard. So this, in effect, highlights how the debate between flutist and flautist is primarily an English language phenomenon. In other languages, it seems that the term is used in often a straightforward derivation of the word flute, with less variation and, of course, much less controversy. So why does this matter to so many people? Why are they getting excised, just like they do with cream and jam on a scone? Or scone, again. Do you call it a scone or a scone? After all, it's just a word, right? As it turns out, the name we choose for ourselves as flute players can mostly carry significant weight, both professionally and personally. For many musicians, the term they use to describe themselves is closely tied to their identity. So this is especially true in the classical music world, where tradition and heritage play a huge role. For some, calling themselves a flautist connects them to the rich history of European classical music. You know, it's a way of aligning themselves with the traditions of great composers and performers who came before them. But on the other hand, some musicians, flute players, prefer flutist because it feels, I suppose, more modern and accessible. They may see flautist as somewhat elitist or pretentious, and they prefer a term that is straightforward and easy to understand, especially when communicating with non-musicians. The term you choose can, in some instances, have professional implications. For example, in the US, where flutist is the standard, using flautists might be seen as unusual or even confusing to some. Conversely, in the UK, using flutist might come across as overly Americanized. Well, we saw that with the happy flutist and the happy flautist. I mean, gosh. So the debate over flutist versus flautist touches on, I suppose, broader questions of professionalism and authority. Some musicians believe that using flautist conveys a higher level of expertise and professionalism, as it aligns with European traditions that are often associated with the deep understanding of classical music. And I suppose others argue that professionalism is about more than just terminology, and I totally agree with that. They believe that what really matters is the quality of the music, the skill of the performer, and their ability to connect with an audience. And from this perspective, whether you call yourself a flutist or a flautist is of no importance to those sitting in front of you, because it's how well you communicate through your music. To add a little more depth to this debate, let's for a moment consider how musicologists and linguistics view the issue. Musicologists who study the history and theory of music often focus on the cultural and historical context of terminology. So they might argue that flautist is a term that reflects a certain cultural heritage and should be preserved as part of the broader history of music. Linguists, on the other hand, might approach the debate from a more descriptive standpoint. They would likely point out that language is always evolving, and terms like flutist and flautists are part of that natural evolution. From a linguistic perspective, neither term is inherently superior to the other. They're, I suppose, just a different way of expressing the same idea. So once I got this feedback about the happy flutist and the happy flautist, I put the word out on social media asking what people's perspectives were on this issue. And here's just a couple of responses I got. So from a US-based professional flutist, they wrote, "I've always called myself a flutist. It's what I was taught, and to me it just makes sense. I've never really understood the need to use flautist. It sounds to me a bit pretentious to my ear. But I know some of my colleagues feel differently. And that said, I don't think the term you should use should define you as a musician. After all, it's your playing that really matters." Totally agree with that. Now, a British flutist friend of mine said, "For me, it's always been flautist. That's what we are taught here, and it's what all my teachers and peers and even my parents use. I think it adds a bit of elegance to the profession. I do understand why some people might prefer flutist, but for me, flautist just feels right." Now, I got a message back from a really well-known flute teacher who says, "I use both terms depending on who I'm talking to. In an international setting, I might say flautist, because that's what a lot of people are expecting. But with my students, I say flutist, because that's what's most common in our region. It's really just a matter of context for me. At the end of the day, I think what matters most is the music and the connection we make with our audience." The perspectives of some younger emerging flutists, flautists, flute players, fluterers who are navigating this debate as they build their careers. I mean, it's a bit weird, isn't it? Navigating a debate, scone, cream jam. For many more younger players, the choice between flutist and flautist is less about tradition and more about personal branding. I started, when I was doing social media, started years ago, calling myself a flautist because that's what I grew up with and that's what everyone around me was using. But when I began posting videos and pictures online and connecting with musicians from other countries, I noticed flutist was more common. And now I actually use both depending on who I'm talking to, and I quite like it. It's my only claim to fame. It's my kind of like being bilingual. I switch terms between flutist and flautist. So with the name Jean-Paul, you would expect me to be bilingual, which I'm actually not. But, you know, if anyone asks me to if I'm bilingual, I say yes, flutist, flautist. Yeah, rubbish, eh? This adaptability among younger players highlights how the debate might evolve in the future. As the world becomes more connected through social media and online communities, and it's bad enough now, but it will evolve into a greater sort of AI entity, we might see a blending of these terms or even the emergence of a new terminology altogether. Flutterer, flutty. Who knows what's going to be sort of develop into? So I was speaking to a linguistic friend of mine, and from a linguistic perspective, we need to gain a deeper understanding of the issue. Language is a living, breathing entity that evolves over time and is influenced by culture, technology and social interactions. The term flutist and flautist are just one example of how language can vary within a single profession. English, well, I presume we all know this, is a language that has borrowed extensively from others: Latin, French, German, and of course Italian, to name a few. This borrowing has enriched the language, but has also led to variations in vocabulary and usage. The existence of both flutist and flautist is a reflection of this linguistic diversity. Linguists, I'm told, often describe language as either being prescriptive or descriptive. A prescriptive approach to language insists on certain rules and standards, and this is the domain of grammar books and style guides. A descriptive approach, on the other hand, observes how language is actually used by people in everyday life. So in the case of flutist versus flautist, a prescriptive linguist might argue that flautist is more correct because it adheres to the Italian origin of the term. A descriptive linguist, however, would likely say that both terms are actually valid, as they are both widely understood and accepted within different communities. Thinking about it more as I sit here, the words we choose to describe ourselves are actually closely tied to our identities. And this is especially true in the world of music, where terminology, I find, often carries cultural and historical significance. So for some, and I've learning as I'm going along, choosing flautist is a way of aligning ourselves with a particular traditional cultural heritage. But for others, flutist represents a more modern, accessible identity. But when you think about it, language is not just about identity, it's also about communication. Yeah, the most important function of language is to convey meaning clearly and effectively. In this sense, I suppose, both flutist and flautist do their job well, as they both clearly identify someone who plays the flute. The real question is whether the nuances of each term, its connotations, its cultural baggage are important enough to warrant the ongoing debate. After exploring the history, the cultural context and linguistic perspectives surrounding flutist versus flautist debate, we can only really arrive at a fundamental question: does it really matter? Is this the term we use to describe ourselves as flute players of any real significance, or is this debate merely a distraction from what truly matters, making music? Because if you were to post this in any of the chat rooms online, it excises so many people who have to come in, and suddenly the making of music is negated by this passion around a certain term. For those who may argue that it does matter, tradition plays a key role. The term flautist, they may say, is a nod to the rich history of classical music, a tradition that deserves to be honoured and preserved. By calling themselves flautists, they align with the great musicians of the past, placing themselves with a lineage of artistic excellence. And I suppose this perspective is not without merit. After all, the classical music world is built on a foundation of tradition, with centuries-old history and practice informing the way we play, teach, and, I suppose, appreciate music today. So in this context, the term flautist carries a weight of history and culture that perhaps, and some may argue against this, that perhaps flutist may lack. On the other hand, though, those who favour flutist might argue that language should evolve to meet the needs of modern speakers. Flutist is a term that is straightforward, easy to understand, and consistent with the English language musical terms. There's a flute, I play the flute, I'm a flutist. There's a piano, I play the piano, I'm a pianist. There's a violin, I play the violin, I'm a violinist. It reflects the way we speak today rather than clinging to the past or trying to be posh. And thinking about it further, this argument is particularly relevant in a world where classical music is constantly evolving and expanding, which it has to do to include new influences and new audiences. By using a term that is accessible and easy to understand, such as flutists, can we make classical music more approachable for a wider audience? Now, I've been sitting here probably for about 20-25 minutes, and I suppose ultimately The choice between flutist and flautist, flute player, fluterer, fluty, ultimately has to come down to your own personal preference. As I have hopefully explained, both terms have their own unique history, cultural significance and linguistic logic. Neither, however, I believe is inherently better or worse than others. They're just different ways of expressing the same idea. We pick up a sideways blowing tube and we honk it. For some musicians, the term they use really is a reflection of their personal identity and values. For others, it's simply a matter of convenience or habit. And for many, just like me, it may not matter at all. I'm more concerned with the music that other people create rather than the label they use. Do we actually get here? A whole podcast on the use of two words, but I'm going to find it interesting to speculate on how this debate might evolve in the future. Will one term eventually win out over the other, or will we continue to see a divide between flutist and flautist? It's possible that as the world becomes more interconnected, we might see a blending of these terms and possibly the emergence of a new term altogether, which, if I had my way, it'll be sideways blowing tuba, or even, to put it more crudely, a honker. So you pick up the instrument and you honk. But for now, the debate will continue, with musicians around the world proudly identifying as either flutist or flautists. And I suppose perhaps that's a good thing. After all, a little healthy debate can be a sign of a vibrant, engaging community. However, circling back to where we started, not looking at a website purely because it says The Happy Flutist rather than Happy Flautist, to me, well, sounds a bit sad. But, I have to jump out of that bias and say, each to their own. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I've got a bit of a numb bum because I've been sat on this park bench for the last 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to get up and at least start walking. So until next time, keep playing, keep practicing, keep the music alive, and may your high F sharp, third octave F sharp, be particularly beautiful. 'Cause mine never is. Goodbye. Talking Flutes and Talking Flutes Extra are podcast productions by the Trevor James Flute Company. For more information, visit trevorjamesflutes.com.